профессор Б.Икес, он и мотор, и топливо Российской экономической школы.
Стойте перед камерой.
Thank you very much, Larry. Usually, I quite enjoy being on these panels to talk about the Russian economy. I figure I can talk forever about it. I know more than everyone else, at least when I'm back home, and it'll be rather easy to intimidate them with knowledge about what's going on in Russia. But looking around at this panel, I kind of anticipated that that strategy would not be successful. And I anticipated that by the time we got to my part of the alphabet, lots of very interesting things would be said. And of course, as everyone else has suggested so far, there's much to agree with. So I thought I should talk about things that are a little different. But just, you know, I mean, it was very expected that people would note that, you know, some of the post-crisis recovery has been weakened as oil prices are coming down. Oil prices and the real exchange rate movements. We know that tax and structural reforms are needed. Some have been implemented, but much more need to be implemented. We need financial reform. We need institutional reform. So those things could be expected. So what should I talk about? Well, one thing that I wish I brought a slide from my room upstairs is about the share of Russian enterprises that remain loss-making, that lose money, just based on official statistics of their reports. And what you observe is quite fascinating. I mean, I have an earlier chart in my book, so you can look there. I'll plug Virtual Economy sound. And what you observe is that the share remains over 45%. The share of loss-making enterprises in the Russian economy has gone down since the crisis, but it stabilized in 2001 and 2002, and it's higher than it was in 1995, for example. Okay? So, despite lots of improvements in the economy, and you can't deny the improvements in the economy, you also see this part, an important part of the economy, that remains for long periods of time loss-making enterprises. Now, why is that important, and what are the causes of that? Well, first of all, it's important. We might ask, what would structural reforms and tax reforms and the normal improvements we talk about imply for these loss-making enterprises? I suppose we could say that if we had enough structural reforms, say on the price of gas and things like that, enforcing bankruptcy laws, tightening credit, that those companies would go out of business. But aside from that, what is in these policies to help them restructure? It doesn't seem that there's much, because these loss-making enterprises are typically loss-making because the capital that's there, and I'll say where, makes it almost impossible to restructure successfully in a market situation. And partly that's because these loss-making enterprises are not randomly dispersed across Russia. There's a large dispersion, and it's very skewed. The regions with the highest shares of loss-making enterprises are farther to the east. And in fact, many regions in the Far East have ratios that are over 50, and some over 60% of the enterprises in the region are currently loss-making. And of course, Moscow and St. Petersburg are the regions in Russia with the lowest, by far, shares of enterprises that are loss-making. And I would think that this is only going to become more costly as market reform develops. Because as market reform develops, it becomes harder to maintain economic activity in regions that are significantly disadvantaged. And I'm fixated on the disadvantage as you move east that comes from the cold. Because in Russia, as you move east, you move to colder climates. You don't have to move north, you just have to move due east. And you get to significantly colder climates. Novosibirsk, same latitude as Moscow, and it's significantly colder if you look at any measures. We all know that. So we might ask, for example, how it would adjust to the market economy in Perm, for example. In Perm, which has a mean January temperature of something about minus 14 centigrade, much colder than here, and it has many days, about a quarter of the days every January that are colder than minus 25 centigrade. The cost of capital is high. The marginal product of capital is low. Marginal product of capital is low because steel tends to buckle at these temperatures. Okay? So what do? You need, one thing that could happen is wages could fall significantly in Perm. Significant enough that there would be such cheap labor that you could operate this higher cost equipment and still survive in an integrated market economy. But that's unlikely because the more Russia becomes a market economy, it's going to be hard to keep wages that low in these eastern regions. Well, you could invest more, but that's not going to happen because why would investment want to go to regions where there's these extra handicaps that are there? Normally you wouldn't have manufacturing in these regions, but Russia's situation is it's stuck with them. Now, Perm, it's interesting because there's one city in America that has the same temperature characteristics as Perm. That's Duluth, Minnesota. I mean, Duluth, Minnesota has the same average January temperature and almost has the same variance of that temperature, although it's more skewed to the cold end in Perm, looking over long periods. Now, Duluth is interesting for another reason, because in the early part of this century, Minnesota, the state of Minnesota, was very angry that all the iron ore was being taken from Minnesota to Pittsburgh and to Chicago to be made into steel. So all the value added was being added in, around the Great Lakes, but not Lake Superior. Okay, so the state of Minnesota threatened that they would impose a tax, almost an export tax on steel, iron ore, which would be technically illegal in the United States, it would be unconstitutional, but they made enough threats that they would do this that in 1915, U.S. Steel built a steel plant in Duluth. Right? So, and they built there where the iron ore is in order to fight off this threat that iron ore would be taxed heavily. So this you could think of in some ways as Soviet location policy, except at least it's location policy next to the iron ore as opposed to in the middle of nowhere. So what happened to this steel plant? The steel plant in Duluth, it's far from the markets, it's right next to the iron ore, it's in an incredibly cold region, and it's in a market economy where transportation costs are relatively low. I mean, there's Great Lakes to take this stuff, the steel. Well, within 20 years, the plant was shut down. The plant lost money every single year from 1915 till 1930, and the plant was shut down. And that's our one American market economy experience that I know of building plant in an area that's too cold for the type of economic activity that's suggested. Now, this brings up this point about investment, and I'll say this knowing that my good friend Andre will be sitting next to me to argue that I'm completely wrong. But transition, I think in some sense just means investment. It means current sacrifice for future gains, and importantly it means this because the problem of transition is that the installed capital is oftentimes the wrong capital. Okay? And that the transition problem is that new investment has to occur to replace the old capital stock that was chosen for inappropriate reasons. Okay? Now, a lot of people who studied the Soviet economy thought at the end of the Soviet period that, look, investment rates are so high in the Soviet Union that Russian transition should lead to much lower investment. But as Yegor Gaidar said about GDP, the same is true for investment, of course. The high investment rates in the Soviet period were high because we were measuring investment the wrong way. In fact, examples about, some of the examples you mentioned would be counted as investment, but they weren't leading to higher productivity in the future either. So investment in the late 80s, early 90s, seemingly high, was of course very low. And since then investment has been low. And now, if you look at post-crisis investment and you take out energy sector and ferrous metallurgy. It's less than it was in 1997. So a lot of investment is needed. But how do you get the investment into the regions which need it with the economy becoming more differentiated? So in some sense, that's I think something that you can't deny, that the economy has become, that the post-crisis situation is one of differentiation. Some regions growing well, some regions behind. The skilled, unskilled one is something that we expected. The regional differentiation is, I think, the very important one. This kind of differentiation can lead to bad institutions. We heard some of that during the sessions at this conference. About the importance of the interaction of politics and economics, and Gerard Rolland's talk just before, and about the relationship between inequality and institutions, and Eric Bergloff's talk. We haven't focused so much on regional differentiations, but this can be a big source of the development of institutions that are not conducive to economic growth. It can lead to policies that are rather odd from an economic point of view. And one thing, if you think that in some of the eastern regions where it's increased, it's very, very cold, and it's not competitive to hire labor to compensate for the low marginal productive capital, what might you observe? You have to get low-cost labor there, and you read stories now about illegal immigration from Uzbekistan and migration of North Koreans into far eastern regions, earning fractions of what Russians would earn, because at those low wages, some of these assets are viable. And then that leads to a political kind of response, a fear of the political system, not an economic system, that if there's this immigration from China and North Korea and Central Asia, then these far eastern regions become less Russian. And then we have to do something to maintain these regions as Russian and implement policies to have Russians, to encourage Russians to live in those regions, when those are costly. And it's only the current subsidies now, in terms of energy and other inputs, that make it possible to employ illegal Uzbek immigrants in these factories as it is. So the maintenance of regional differentiation can lead to policies that can be socially inefficient and prevent the positive developments that are ready to occur. I'll just close up with two thoughts. One is that the big opportunity cost of these situations is that there's obviously lots of flight capital that's ready to return to Russia when things improve. And so any big changes in the institutional environment and in people's beliefs about the future of the situation is going to lead to an extra boost, because it's not just going to change domestic behavior, but that capital will come back. That's what we've learned from other countries. I think the regional income differentiation can lead to, because it leads to politics created by governors who live in regions that will lose from normal market transition, it can lead to the wrong institutions, which keeps that flight capital out there for a long time. And just finally, so since I should be totally outrageous, Igor Gaidar gave us a century of Russian economic history. So I'm going to ask you for a millennium. Of history now. I want to think of the following question. Suppose you had data, okay, we'll just make this up. You had data on the level of the quality of Russian democracy, decade by decade, since, I don't know, since the year 1000, okay, AD. Well, it'd be better to go to 800 AD, okay? And you have, which would be easy to calculate, a measure of the the geographic center of the Russian population. Right? What would the correlation with that? I think everyone can understand that if you leave out the 1990s, okay, and you go from 800 to the 1989, that as the center of Russia's population moved to the east, the quality of Russian democracy declined dramatically, mostly in probably the first 500 years, and then very much in the 20th century again. And so I think, well, we could think about why that's the case. And I think it would be very good if the center of Russia's population moved back towards the West, because that would work towards improving Russia's democracy and solidifying the economy. So I'll stop there.